Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our annual Diversity and Inclusion Summit. Over the next 2 hours, we will hear from change makers and stakeholders for a discussion on steps that could lead to meaningful change and a more inclusive society. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Gilead and the Rockefeller Foundation, for their support of today's two-part event. On today's program, we will examine how diversity, equity, and inclusion are being prioritized at all levels of society, and what we are doing to build pathways to opportunity for America's younger generations. I'm especially happy to be joined by colleagues from the newsroom, Raphael Bernal and Julia Manchester, to help lead these conversations. Raphael joins me for the first band, and Julia and Raphael will be your guides for session 2. We have some terrific speakers lined up, so stick around for the entire program. Before we get underway, though, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillDiversity. We are also broadcasting live, and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience, occasional trouble with the video, but refreshing the page should, in most cases, fix the problem. Now, our first guest is Derrick Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP, the nation's largest civil rights organization with over 500,000 members and supporters. He formerly served as Vice Chairman of the NAACP National Board of Directors, as well as State President for the NAACP Mississippi State Conference. Derrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
First off, you've led the NAACP since 2017. What are your goals for the next 6 months to 1 year?
Well, our goal is to ensure democracy work for all. I started 4 years ago in this month, and we externally looked at a 5-year civic engagement plan to ensure African Americans across the country can enhance their voice and civic participation, but also to work very hard to right-size the concept of diversity, not only in governance, but in the corporate space.
There's been a racial awakening in this country, especially since the death of George Floyd, but others. What progress have you seen since then, and what other progress needs to be made in the months and years ahead?
Last summer, we witnessed for the first time in the history of this country individuals reacting to the inhumanity that they've seen on screen or on the digital platforms. And that reaction truly looked like America. It was young, old, male, female, black, white. And it was around a value proposition that Black Lives Matter, a value proposition that this country has not always honored. And so for that alone was progress, and we see that momentum carry out across the country. Some of the concerns is the backlash from that, because with that type of groundswell that we must as a nation honor a value proposition, the pushback is from this notion of white supremacy. And we also have seen that over the last 5 years, and unfortunately much of it germinating from the White House under the past administration. So now we're in the middle of this tension, whether or not this nation is going to respect all of their citizens and all of our uniqueness, or whether or not this notion of white supremacy should be the predominant narrative. And I submit that democracy and white supremacy cannot coexist.
And what do you think should be done about it? I mean, obviously, we've seen, unfortunately, white supremacy is still alive and well in this country. What do policymakers have to do?
First of all, we have to acknowledge the role of government and respect the institutions of government. When we have an election, and we've just seen this play out in Arizona and just recently in Georgia, when the will of voters speak, we must respect it and transition towards governance. It is a legitimate conversation to discuss the role of government, tax policy, who gets taxed, who's not taxed, how those tax dollars are spent. It should not be accepted that when the outcome of the election is clear, that you still have the ability to try to destroy the system so you can create a system that look like an outcome that you're pursuing. That's not a democracy. Nor should state legislative bodies, as they've done over the last 4 years, try to work hard to suppress vote in an effort to select their voters as opposed to voters select the elected officials. And so that's the tension that currently exists. And we must, as a citizen, it is not about partisanship or political party affiliation. This is about our democracy and respecting our Constitution and to ensure that equal protection under the law is afforded to every citizen. That's what we need to do as a nation, particularly the corporate community.
As you know, there's pending legislation on Capitol Hill in the Democratic-run House and Senate on voting rights, also dealing with suppression. There are not the votes to get there, certainly not to 60 in the Senate. Do you think the filibuster should be carved out and eliminated for that type of legislation?
Well, protecting of one's right to vote should not be a partisan exercise. It shouldn't be a Democrat or Republican responsibility. It should be the responsibility of the members of Congress, in this case, the United States Senate. When there was a need to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, it passed the Senate 98-0. 2 members were absent because it's not a partisan issue. It is an issue of upholding the tenets of our Constitution, that social contract. And now what we're looking at, unfortunately, is the discussion around one's right to fully engage and participate in our democracy is on the table as if it's a partisan exercise. And another unfortunate part of that, we couldn't get 10 Republicans to agree to investigate a failed insurrection on our nation's capital, an investigation. We would be hard-pressed to get 10 Republicans in this current political environment to support legislation to uphold our constitutional right that every citizen are eligible to cast an effective ballot. And a procedural rule should not be the reason why we cannot move forward. It should be a simple question. So for that matter, the filibuster is an impediment to our progress. It is an impediment for us to uphold our constitutional rights.
You know, I've talked to a lot of people who are for that voting rights legislation, and depending on who you talk to, there are some that are disappointed that the White House has not done more to push the party, the Democratic Party, to get rid of the filibuster. Obviously, the president has given a lot of speeches on this, but some who are really pushing for this say it's got to get done this year because it's a non-election year, and they need to do more. They need to act. Do you think this has to get done this year, and would you like to see the White House do more?
But absolutely must get done in this Congress this year because we have midterm elections coming up. We have state legislative bodies redrawing political boundary lines we call redistricting. We have local jurisdictions doing the same. This would be the first time of the since 1960 that we'll go through a redistricting process without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. It is unconscionable that we are in this space, and I push back the notion that this is the responsibility of Democrats. This is responsibilities of members of the United States Senate to do their job. This is not a partisan exercise. This is us ensuring that every legitimate citizen can cast a ballot. And whether it's the White House, members of the Senate, or the House, we must move away from the partisan rancor around voting right protections and protecting our democracy and really be the patriots we say we are and carry out the work we send our young people abroad to fight for, having a representative democracy. Anything less is a betrayal on our Constitution.
Some news of the week. John Gruden stepped down as coach of the Raiders this week after emails surfaced that were racist and homophobic and extremely offensive. There are hundreds of thousands of more emails in this ongoing investigation, which started with the Washington football team. My first question is on this issue, does the NFL have a racism problem?
Well, the NFL has an equity problem. I mean, you have football player who took a knee respectfully in protest of social justice issues outside of football, of course, but he had the First Amendment right to do that, and he's been banned from playing football. And you have a coach over the last 10 years who've had allowed messages to go out that was both racist, it was demeaning to women, it was unfortunate. And it took an outcry to have him forced to resign. We have a cultural problem with the NFL. And that inequity that a football player displaying his objection to how individuals are being killed in the street is now banned, but a coach felt comfortable enough to send emails around, tell you that the culture of the NFL needs to be examined. It needs to be a more equitable approach on how to handle issues that are against a community norm that we want to uphold that's inclusive of all people. And we need to reset and right-set how we've treated individuals who simply was doing what they thought was important to send a message around social justice, so that they're no longer operating with a black scar and banned from the league. And for anyone to say, well, he's not banned from the league, he hasn't been back and able to play, he hasn't even been able to practice or try out.
Do you think the rest of those emails should be released so we get to see all of the emails and the back and forth of what we don't know at this moment?
If you want to address the culture within the league, it's not only the person who sent the emails, what about the people who received it and said nothing?
Right.
Why are we 10 years later addressing this issue? So yes.
You recently requested a meeting. You had some tweets on this with Facebook after hate speech revelations came to light. What is the status? Are you going to meet with Facebook?
This time last year, actually it was in June of last year, we partnered with several groups, Anti-Defamation League, Color Change, Common Sense, LULAC, to raise serious questions around Facebook as a platform, because we've seen a trend that they were using the platform to accelerate profits by allowing racial hate and white supremacist groups to advertise, recruit, radicalize, and carry out harm to individuals, and then we realized that it was also causing harm to our democracy. And what we said last year with the campaign Stop Hate for Profit came full circle after the whistleblower came out and confirmed what we were saying all along. The leadership of Facebook denied it. We knew it was true, and we stand firm that this platform needs guardrails. It has become a sovereign nation within sovereign nations, causing much community harm, causing harm to our governance structure and our ability to breed trust in our government. So that's why we call for a meeting. But more importantly, we have to take a hard look and examine whether or not the guardrails, whether or not we should be looking at antitrust legislation, whether or not we should be looking at Section 230, Community Standards Act, to hold this platform accountable to keep people safe and to protect our democracy.
Last question on corporate America, which has pledged to become more diverse. How do we keep their feet to the fire and make sure that that's just not a temporary goal press release? As we examine statements from last year, commitments from last year, what we're finding is there are some companies moving forward with those commitments, but others are not. And so I think transparency is how we keep them accountable to those statements, those value propositions, as well as when we expose it, publicly traded companies only have one responsibility, and that's to maximize profit for shareholders. And as community understand the value propositions companies have for diversity or inclusion, consumers will begin to make wiser choices of whether or not they want to support companies that lack the values of diversity and inclusion that America need to become. We cannot tap into new markets if we are not empowering the very consumers that will allow the companies to grow. Derrick Johnson, thank you for joining us. Very informative interview. Really appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.